thank you for joining us today. Today, we are very fortunate to have a presentation by Tracey Reed, who's a certified holistic nutritional consultant and instructor at the Canadian School of Natural Nutrition. She's the recipient of the 2018 Clinical Excellence Award and the co-author of Histamine Haven, the essential guide and cookbook to histamine and mast cell activation. Her clinical practice has a strong focus on helping people struggling with histamine and mast cell mediated health issues. She's a self-proclaimed gut geek and loves everything about the gut microbiome and leaky gut. Tracey's passion is teaching people how to eat to fix the biochemistry of their body to address what is the root of their health conditions. Welcome, Tracey.
Thank you. I am so excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm just going to go right ahead and jump into slides if that works for everyone. Sharon, are people asking questions through the chat?
No, we're doing it through the Q&A, which I will do as we go along, so you don't have to worry.
Yep. Okay. And so, yeah, I'll just let people know then that I am happy to answer questions throughout the entire presentation. So Sharon will just be monitoring that. So we'll get these slides up. Okay, here we go. So today is going to be sort of a simple introduction to some dietary strategies, and I'll talk specifically to you about why they are relevant from a pulmonary fibrosis perspective. So we'll look specifically at anti-inflammatory foods and why you should have those in your diet. We'll talk about some swaps you can make for sugar because sugar is inflammatory and why that's beneficial for lungs. And then there's a recipe to try that hopefully people will have access to. So we'll start with the anti-inflammatory foods component. So colorful vegetables and fruit are really important for overall health. And I've really tried to draw attention here to some that maybe aren't part of your normal diet. So I think many people feel that they eat a lot of vegetables and fruit, but variety could potentially be lacking. So variety is really, really important when we're looking at vegetable or fruit consumption. So a lot of people talk about the idea of eating from the rainbow. So I've listed some colors here to focus on. And again, I've tried to kind of focus on some foods that might not be on your plate regularly. So if we look at green things, often when I mention Brussels sprouts, people will say, well, I eat them for Thanksgiving, this one holiday, this one day of the year. But Brussels sprouts are often readily available. Asparagus, now certainly in Canada, we don't have a very long asparagus season. Fresh asparagus that's grown locally in Canada tends to be in the spring. So something that I like to do with asparagus so that I have it year round is that when it's actually fresh and local and seasonal, I will buy a whole bunch of it. And one of my favorite things to eat is asparagus soup. So I just make these great big batches and get it into my freezer. So then I can have asparagus year round. Fresh herbs are so delicious, and they just have incredible health-giving properties. So that could be things like basil or parsley, cilantro, thyme, oregano, anything that is, leafy and green and falls into that herb category is a great thing to add. And it brings so much flavor to your plate. If we move on to red, beets are really, really great. Cranberries are something you might not eat too often, but they're often available in the freezer section of your grocery store. Pomegranate. So again, in Canada, not super easy to get, but I've been seeing more and more, and it seems to be a little bit seasonal still, but frozen pomegranate, where those areoles, those little seeds, are bagged and frozen. So you can look for those in your freezer section. Orange things that are, again, maybe not something you would eat as often would be things like squashes, and there's so many different varieties, yams, or the orange sweet potato. They're just slightly different, and cantaloupe. If we look at yellow, parsnips are a great addition, grapefruit and mango is readily available in the freezer section. So that's a great way to get mango year round. If we look at blue and purple category, so this is such a beautiful, deep, rich color. Blueberries, and there are other berries, blackberries fall into this category as well. Radicchio. So this is something that I don't think a lot of people eat or maybe don't even know about, but it looks like a small red cabbage. It is a little bit bitter in flavor, but when you cook it, that bitterness diminishes. So that's a really nice addition. And then red cabbage. I love cabbage because it's inexpensive, it's available year round, like it's such a good staple. So making sure you get some red cabbage in there as well is a nice way to bring some color in. And then we don't often think of white as a color, but it is a very important color group when we look at vegetables, because it includes things like cauliflower, but mushrooms they've got some really unique compounds, turnips, or something like cassava root. So just hopefully when you start to think about, what colorful fruits and vegetables means, hopefully some of these vegetables that we've talked about will start you to look at a bigger repertoire. So the reason all of these colorful fruits and vegetables are so important when we're talking about pulmonary fibrosis are that they can reduce lung inflammation, they can help to prevent lung injury, and in some of the research literature where they're using mouse models, it shows that they're actually protective in these experimental models. And the reason colorful fruits and vegetables are so beneficial is because of something called polyphenols. Now, polyphenols are compounds that give the color and the flavor to plants. And this is where we get like the deeper the color and the deeper the flavor, the more polyphenols we find in food. So for example, if we look at berries, when you think of a berry, the color is so intense and the color goes all the way through that berry. And so those are very good sources of polyphenols. Herbs are another really good example from a flavor perspective. So just the intensity of flavor from herbs. So polyphenols are the compounds that we want to be getting into our body for these benefits. It's these polyphenols that are what are making these foods anti-inflammatory. So again, just this idea, eat from the rainbow, it is going to benefit your lungs. So some things to think about maybe next time you're shopping, whether you're shopping in a store or online these days. You want to keep in mind this rainbow. So what are some strategies you can use to help you expand the color variety that you are taking in? So maybe you could think about adding 3 colorful vegetables that you don't normally eat to your shopping cart, or maybe adding a vegetable from each of those color groups that we just looked at. So green, orange, yellow, include that white and brown group as well. So just something to start to think about. Do you even use a shopping list? If you do use a shopping list, then now might be a really good opportunity to just jot down some of the fruits or vegetables that you like, but that you don't often buy.
Tracey,
Yeah.
to ask you, given the cost of fresh fruits and vegetables these days, are there anything that you could suggest that might be less expensive or
Yes.
better?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is that frozen is a brilliant option. So people have looked at, like, is the nutrition value of frozen as good as fresh? So we know that we do lose a little bit of nutritional value when we freeze things, but here's the flip side of that coin. When food that goes into the freezer section is really, really good quality. So that is fruits or vegetables that have been harvested at their peak ripeness. And when stuff is harvested at that stage, that's when it has the most nutrient density. And I'll give you a contrast to help you understand this. So in contrast, so in the Canadian winter, right, we often get during the winter, we get a lot of our produce from California, but that has to be shipped a long way. And during that shipping process, food starts to lose nutritional value as well. And so a frozen option, again, will have slightly less value than, fresh, seasonal, but so will stuff that has been brought from, outside of your local area. So that means that frozen is a really, really good option, especially in Canada during our long winter months, and it's often much more cost effective. I talked about cabbage as a really nice option because it's so affordable. So I do really like cabbage for that reason. Onions are another, people don't think of onions as like, oh, this is a main vegetable. They kind of think of it as like, I'm going to just add a bit of onion to my stir fry or my soup as a flavor enhancer. But you could also think of onions as, part of a main. And onions, again, are often, they're readily available year round and can be inexpensive. And apples too. Apples are always available and are pretty inexpensive.
Great, thank you, Tracey. Another question I have for you that, you mentioned some other substitutes that you can buy, but what about growing your own vegetables? Like, what are some easy ones to do that, you can still get the good nutritional value, but honestly, if you're on a budget, how do
you... growing it's a great way to have food that is inexpensive. And, in our Canadian climate, lettuces, any leafy greens, so lettuce, kale, chard, any of those leafy greens grow very, very well. Carrots grow really easily. Herbs. So even for somebody who doesn't have a garden, herbs can be grown on a windowsill. If you have a balcony, they can be grown in pots out on a balcony in the summer months. So those are also very easy to grow. Zucchini is very, very easy to grow as well. So those are some of the simpler options. And actually green beans and peas are very, very easy to grow as well. So those would be some of my recommendations for some of the things that are quite simple and not, very labor intensive in the garden either.
And Tracey, I know you mentioned a lot of these great vegetables, but someone wanted to know, if they come from a different ethnic culture than the European culture.
Yeah.
And so what about some of the fruits and vegetables that you see in some of the ethnic stores? Like, for example, here in Ontario, we have this thing called the TNT supermarket,
Yeah, yeah.
all nations, right?
Hmm.
They carry fruits and vegetables from Japan, Korea, all around the world. And
Yeah.
so, like, what would you say would be some good options from there?
All excellent. Yeah. So so if I were to think like specifically things that we wouldn't find in a Canadian grocery store that we would find in, some of these different ethnic grocery stores, tamarind and turmeric, some of these like things that we use to season our food. Those are really, really lovely. There are some root vegetables, things like cassava, taro root, which fall into that kind of white category and are really excellent sources of something called resistant starch. So, those can be brought in, but the diversity of greens that come from some of these other countries that we don't really grow here, that's just a great place to explore as well. Yeah. And I mean, coconut's not really a fruit or vegetable, but coconut is another, it has some great health benefits. That would be another thing that you could bring in. Yeah, excellent question.
Thank you.
Okay. So once you start to expand the color profile of what you're putting into your grocery cart, then it's really important actually to ask how you're going to cook or how you're going to prepare these vegetables. And so I've got 3 different images here. You can see there's a salad that contains some raw ingredients. There's a stir fry on here, and then there's sort of an oven meal where everything gets put into one tray. And it's actually really, really important to eat a combination of raw and cooked, because there are nutrients in raw food that are best preserved in a raw state. So vitamin C is an example of that. But then there are nutrients that actually become more available as we cook food. And so a really good example of that would be like beta carotene in carrots. So that's not something we can't really get that nutrient out of the carrot very well, but once it's cooked, then we can. So it's important to have a combination of raw and cooked. And I've used the examples here of a stir fry and this like one pan meal that goes in the oven as a way to demonstrate, where you can get a lot of color variety into one simple meal. So it doesn't have to be complicated. You don't have to be, cooking multiple dishes. You can do everything, in one frying pan or one baking dish. So just some things to think about. And really think about, what's your favorite way to eat vegetables? Do you like a stir fry? Do you like them roasted? What are your favorite vegetables to have in salads? So just again, what's your favorite way to eat these is going to be probably the most important deciding factor.
Tracey, so what about grilling your vegetables?
Yeah, grilling is good as well. The one thing about grilling, you don't want to get that black char on your food, or you want to try to minimize it as much as possible. So when you start to get black char on food, it produces something called advanced glycation end products, which are kind of detrimental to human health. So if you're using a barbecue, for example, then you want to kind of do that low and slow cooking method so you don't get that real char on it.
So what about steaming?
Sorry?
Steaming your vegetables?
Yeah. Steaming is another great cooking method that really retains the nutritional value. And I would even say microwaving. There was a lot of controversy around microwaving for many, many years, but a really, really great research paper came out a couple of years ago. So, I just talked about these advanced glycation end products that can occur with charring. And that was sort of the biggest argument with microwave cooking, was that it can also produce these end products. But what they did in this study, and this is why the study was really brilliant, is they looked at microwaving compared to other cooking methods. And they found that, in fact, microwaving produces less of these advanced glycation end products than other methods of cooking do. So we've kind of like debunked the concerns around microwaving. So for people who don't have the energy to be in the kitchen, and if you have a microwave, that can be a really helpful tool. Another tool that I absolutely love is a pressure cooker. So I have an Instant Pot pressure cooker. So I love to create soups and stews. So that's another way to just have a whole bunch of diversity, in a really quick, simple meal.
Thank you, Tracey. What about this one person said that she uses like tempura batter for the vegetables. She coats them and she does a quick fry because that just makes her children eat them. Like, is that okay?
Yeah, darn those kids. It's always a challenge. Yeah. So that would be fine for sure. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, you know what? I will go back to that question. So one thing, whenever you're frying, it's really, really important to look at the oil that you're frying in, especially from an inflammatory perspective. So if you want to keep things anti-inflammatory and you're frying food, ghee is really, really lovely. Coconut oil is really, really lovely, or avocado oil. And avocado oil, especially if we're talking about kids, avocado oil probably has the most neutral flavor. So if we're looking at frying and keeping things anti-inflammatory, the ghee, coconut oil, and avocado oil would be my top 3 choices.
Tracey, someone said that, I was asking, since you were talking about salads, by putting your fruits and vegetables in a salad, what kind of oils or what kind of salad dressing would you recommend to, keep the flavor, but keep the nutrients to help?
Yeah. So salad dressing is actually really, really important because some of the nutrients in those fruits and vegetables are fat soluble, which means they actually need fat for you to be able to absorb them. And so my favorite for salad is olive oil, like bar none. Olive oil just has such a lovely flavor on salads. But avocado oil also works. And again, avocado oil has, it actually, I should give you a good little tip here. If your avocado oil does not have a neutral flavor, it is very likely rancid. There are a lot of brands that are selling rancid avocado oil, which is really a shame. So I in North America, there's one called Chosen Foods. So the Chosen Foods brand is my favorite brand for avocado oil, or one of my favorites. The other one that I really like is from a company called Primal Kitchens. That one's a little bit harder to find sort of in your everyday grocery store. But so Chosen Foods and Primal Kitchens for avocado oil are my 2 favorites. If you buy a bottle of it and it just has, it's almost like a rotten avocado flavor or an overripe avocado flavor, then that means that oil has probably gone rancid, and that would be very inflammatory. So you don't want to be using that. Yeah, so those are my favorites for salads. Like I said, olive oil, #1 for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions on that topic before we start talking about sugar?
Nope, not at the moment.
Okay, great. So let's look at replacing sugars. So sugars are hidden everywhere. Some things we know have sugar in them. For example, if you look at the cookies in this image, we know cookies have sugar. If you look at the muffins here, muffins typically have sugar as well. But we'll look in the next slide or two, we'll look at some sort of hidden sources of sugar. But on the far left is this bowl of cereal, and cereal has to be one of the worst places where there is a lot of sugar. And in addition, most breakfast cereal is made from flour. So whether that's a wheat flour or a rice flour or ancient grain flours, whatever, they're often made from flour. And flour, doesn't matter what kind of flour, it could be a gluten-free flour, it could be your basic wheat flour, could be a multi-grain flour, a sprouted grain flour. But if it's made from flour, as everything on this slide is flour, your body can't tell the difference between sugar and flour. Flour converts to sugar so rapidly, in fact, more rapidly than table sugar. So that's something to, in hindsight, I wish I'd put another slide in here about flour, but these things are, in addition to the added sugar, they really, really have a profound impact on your blood sugar levels. So it's really, really important to think about not only how much sugar has been added to food, but are there naturally occurring sugars as well? But the really great thing is that we don't need to deny ourselves of the pleasures of eating sugar. We can start to replace them with some different alternatives. So the reason that we want to swap sugar out is that sugar is very, very inflammatory. Research has shown that high blood sugar promotes the development of pulmonary fibrosis. And we also see that there's a high correlation of diabetes to idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. And then sugar also impairs our immune function. And so this is really important when we look at respiratory infection, because it means it's going to be harder, or really any kind of infection. But when we're looking at the lungs, respiratory infection is of more significant concern. And so sugar is going to inhibit our immune system's ability to fight off that infection well. So this is a slide that I like because this gives you some idea of how much sugar you might actually be consuming without even knowing it. So the average daily intake of sugar is between 15 to 19 teaspoons per day. And if we look at, and that's a lot, if you were to measure out, 15 teaspoons of sugar, you'd see, that's a fair amount of table sugar. So a cup of apple juice. So we think of apple juice as, maybe being a healthy drink. And very often it does not have added sugars, but it does have natural sugar. And any kind of juice, the sugars are very, very rapidly absorbed and have a really significant impact on your blood sugar levels. And so juice is quite different from eating, a whole apple or a whole orange, because when you eat the whole food, the sugar is sort of bound to the fiber in that food, and you get a much slower release into your bloodstream. So whole fruit is not a concern, but juices are. So in 1 cup, that's a very small glass of apple juice, 6.5 teaspoons of sugar. If you're the kind of person who likes to pop into a coffee shop and get a medium iced cappuccino or any of the, sort of flavored coffees, 12 teaspoons. So just an insanely shocking amount of sugar in those beverages. A soft drink has 5 teaspoons. And it's really important, I think, to talk about soft drinks because there's so many diet soft drinks that are sugar-free, but the artificial sweeteners that they're replacing sugar with are very, very damaging to the body as well. A can of tomato soup has 3 teaspoons. So this is an example of a place where you just might not be expecting sugar at all. But most packaged foods will have some sugar in them. And then if you enjoy flavored yogurts, that's another place where you'll find a lot of sugar. So for example, strawberry yogurt has over 4 teaspoons. So again, this is, this list could go on and on and on, but this is just to give you an idea of some of the places where you'll find sugar where you may not really have thought about there being that much sugar.
So Tracey, when you're eating those fruits and vegetables in their raw form, or if you're cooking with them, how do you know how much sugar is in them if you see this list here?
So if it's a whole fruit or vegetable, I would actually not be concerned about the amount of sugar unless you already have diabetes or have blood sugar issues. And in that case, you just want to be mindful. This is a very rough guideline, but usually I would say for fruit, you want to have 2 pieces a day, not more than 2 pieces a day. And it helps if you have that fruit with some additional fat or protein. So the additional fat or protein will slow the release of sugars into the bloodstream. So I'll give you a few examples of that. So maybe slicing up an apple and dipping it into a nut butter, an almond butter or something like that. That's a nice way to get a little bit of fat and protein with your apple to slow the release of the sugars. If you like berries, you could add some heavy cream to your berries, and that would be another great way to slow down the release of sugars into the bloodstream. But for most people, if you don't have any blood sugar issues, I would not be concerned about fruit. And again, I usually recommend about 2 pieces a day.
So Tracey, someone wanted to know, how are artificial sweeteners damaging?
So one of the mechanisms is that they alter the gut microbiome. And so that's a pretty big topic to introduce. But if you're not familiar with the term gut microbiome, the gut microbiome refers to a collection of microbes that live in your GI tract. And these microbes have a lot of health promoting benefits for us as humans. We really coexist with them. If you eat yogurt, or maybe you've seen a commercial, on TV or on a poster, where they promote the idea of eating yogurt for the probiotics in that yogurt. When you eat probiotic foods, you are contributing microbes to your own community. So we have foods that contain microbes like yogurt and kefir and kombucha and sauerkraut. But we have trillions of these microbes in our GI tract. So the problem with the artificial sweeteners really is that they alter this microbial community in our guts. And aspartame in particular has also been really well researched in regards to brain health, and it has some really serious implications for brain health as well. Yeah, excellent question.
I have another question for you, Tracey. Are smoothies like fruit, maybe some vegetables and unflavored yogurt, the equivalent of juices, or is the sugar?
No. So smoothies are great. Again, you're using the whole fruit in there. And I always tell people, don't use a juice as your, liquid in a smoothie. But if you're using whole fruit and you have yogurt or kefir or even avocado, some people like to put in different oils, like an MCT oil. All of those things contain fat that's going to help. A lot of people like to put protein sources in there as well. So that might be some kind of protein powder, or you could put some seeds in there, like hemp seed is really nice. It's a whole complete protein. So yeah, if you're building a smoothie and your framework is sort of, some fruit, some vegetable, and then some fat and or protein, I think it's a really, really nice way to get a lot of variety and a lot of different colors into your diet. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so when we look at sweeteners, and what we want to do is swap out things like table sugar for something that is called a nutritive sweetener. And a nutritive sweetener just means that there's still some nutritional value attached to these sweeteners. So with table sugar, we see there's, other than the sugar as a carbohydrate, there's really no vitamin or mineral content at all with many of the sugars that are used, in packaged foods. So I've got a few things here to kind of mull over. So on the left is a nice dark chocolate. And so dark chocolate typically will contain some sugar, but what you want to focus on is consuming a chocolate that is 80% or higher cocoa content. And so cocoa is really rich, again, in these polyphenols that we talked about earlier, which have these anti-inflammatory properties. So just making sure, again, it's like 80% or higher cocoa content, or I'm starting to see in the health food stores now, starting to see chocolates that are being sweetened with like a maple sugar or a coconut sugar. So if you have access to those would be really nice options as well. Honey is bar none my favorite sweetener. It still has enzymes, and it's just a lovely. And I should clarify, a lot of the honey in the grocery store shelves is not pure honey. It has unfortunately been diluted with other syrups. So this is something to be aware of as a consumer, as somebody who's shopping. If you have access to a farmer's market or a local farmer, or maybe you even have a neighbor who is producing their own honey, if you're able to get like fresh honey from one of these sources, the quality is going to be so much better than most of what you're getting on grocery store shelves. But honey is just so lovely. It's really nice in a cup of tea or coffee. It's really nice in baked goods. It's very, very versatile. And then another thing would be something like dried fruit, which again, it's going to have, it will be a fairly concentrated source of sugar, but it still is bound to all of that fiber. And so it's going to give you a much slower release into your bloodstream. And then especially if you combine it with some nuts or seeds into, a bit of a trail mix, then you're going to have that additional fat and protein. So that sort of trail mix idea is also a lovely way to have some of these nutritive sweeteners, things that are sweet but have the nutritional value still attached. And dates are a really nice dried fruit that are incredibly versatile in, things like muffins. You can actually use them as a way to sweeten muffins. You can actually blend them into a nice paste, for example. So there's a lot of ways to still really enjoy sweets, especially if you have a sweet tooth, but still support, an anti-inflammatory approach.
Tracey, someone would like to know, what about the protein bars? People are always saying that they're nutritious for you and everything, but when you look at the label, there's so much sugar.
Yes, this is my biggest pet peeve with bars in general, like granola bars, protein bars. There's so much sugar in them. I've been on this like personal quest to find a bar that I'm happy feeding to my family. One of the ones that I really like, the company or the brand is called RX. So they're called RX bars. So just the two letters R and X. And they use dates as their base. So that's how they sweeten it, is with dates. They use egg white as a protein source. And then they have a whole variety of flavors. So they have, chocolate chip, blueberry, right? They've got nut and seed combinations, dried fruit options. So that's one of the ones that I probably like the best right now, that's readily available on the market. Yeah, I wish somebody, and occasionally I see another bar that I really like, and they just don't seem to last on the market. I think by and large, the demand is for kind of the sugary bars, unfortunately.
Okay. Someone also wanted to ask you, because you were talking about muffins, what about high fiber intake, like psyllium? Is it bad for PF? But they need it for IBS, right?
Okay. Yeah. So that's a really good question. And to be honest with you, I can't answer it specifically for PF. I haven't looked to see if there's research around that. But so psyllium is, it's what we call a soluble fiber. It absorbs a ridiculous amount of water. And so it's really, really important that if you're using psyllium, to really, really make sure your water consumption is very, very high, because if you don't, psyllium can actually create more compaction in the stools, in the bowels. But I actually use psyllium myself as a binder sometimes. So like maybe instead of an egg in recipes, a lot of my clients don't tolerate eggs, so we'll just put like a tablespoon of psyllium into a baked good instead of an egg. And that's probably my favorite way to consume it, is sort of within baked goods. I know some people will mix it into a smoothie. It'll get thick really, really fast, or they might mix it into yogurt or something. But I think psyllium, when it's like a nice clean psyllium source, as opposed to something like Metamucil, if it's used in moderation, yeah, it can be a really nice addition, especially if you're struggling with constipation. Okay, so I think we're almost at the end of the slides. There's a recipe that Sharon, maybe you can share how people can access it, but yeah, sending along a recipe for, it's called the cabbage apple fennel slaw. And so this is a great way to bring in that red cabbage that I was talking about earlier. Maybe you've never had a fennel bulb before, and so this would be a great recipe to, explore a new vegetable. And the dressing in this recipe has ginger and turmeric and garlic, which are all incredibly anti-inflammatory. It's a really, really lovely dressing. So this is just a great, and the dressing is very versatile. You can use the dressing on a whole bunch of other stuff as well. So that is that. And so just to summarize what we've been talking about today and sort of these takeaway ideas: buy and eat 3 vegetables or fruits that you don't normally eat, or, choose something from every color in the rainbow, whatever resonates more with you. I'm just noticing the cranberries on the image here, and cranberries are actually quite easy to get year round in the freezer section again. So they're, again, something that people don't normally think to add to their diet, but I find, a few of them in a smoothie is really lovely. It just lends a nice sort of tartness. And they're also really great in like a sheet pan meal. So when you have, just a baking sheet. So one of the things I like to do for a simple meal is I'll throw a variety of vegetables and maybe chop up some chicken or turkey. And I'll coat those in a little bit of avocado oil and throw that onto a baking sheet. But sometimes I throw cranberries in there as well. And it's just a really nice addition and a great way to add some color. So just think about how you can kind of explore color in your own diet. And then choosing nutritive sweeteners. So whether it's dried fruit or dark chocolate or honey or maple syrup. I didn't really touch on maple syrup, but maple syrup is another, I know it's not as readily available everywhere in the world, but it's another sweetener that still has quite a lot of nutritional value attached to it. So it's a nice one as well. And keep in mind that these should be consumed in moderation. You don't want to be, consuming a cup of honey every day, for example. And then hopefully you'll try out the recipes as well.
Yes, we'll download them from your site, and we'll do that. There was one question that we didn't get to ask you because you had passed it already. Someone wanted to know, what about air frying? You know how we talked about frying foods and things.
Yeah.
Air frying?
Yeah. So my only concern with air frying, it's a really convenient and quick way to prepare food. One of my concerns about air frying, again, is the kind of fat that people are using. So it often utilizes less fat just because you just often spray a little bit of fat on. And I do not advocate for a low fat diet. What I really advocate for is anti-inflammatory fats. Fats are so vitally important for cellular health. Like every single cell in our body is made out of fat. And so it is really, really important that we have fat in our diet. But again, we want them to be health promoting anti-inflammatory fats. So similar to, what I was talking about when we were discussing, raw versus cooking. With the air fryer, you want to be using a fat that's going to be anti-inflammatory. So, and when we're talking about with heat, that's going to be things like avocado oil, coconut oil, ghee. And we could even bring animal fats into that conversation. So things like duck fat, or, it might be harder to use in an air fryer, but there are fats that are rendered from animals, things like tallow and lard. And we do need saturated fats in our diet as well. We don't want to go overboard, but yeah. So with the air fryer, if you're using something like a vegetable oil, a corn oil, a canola oil, those become oxidized with heat and they become oxidized with air. And this is where, with the air fryer, because of that air circulation component, if you're using an oil that is already inflammatory and then you're adding heat, which is going to make it more inflammatory, and then you're adding the air component, which is going to make it even more inflammatory, that's something you just want to be very, very cognizant and cautious of. So yeah, just choosing the right fats for that or oils is going to be really important. Yeah, that was a long answer.
People wanted to ask you, what about things like cheese and pâtés and other things that they like to eat? How sometimes you just want to enjoy a nice glass of wine, have some pâté and cheese with your crackers.
Yeah. So, that is actually such a hard question to answer. But so pâté, generally speaking, pâté is actually really, really good for you. So pâté is made from liver, and liver is probably the most nutrient dense food we have on our planet. So pâté from that perspective is brilliant. My only concern with pâté would be, are there preservatives in there? So pâté, and I should point out, most pâtés have dairy in them. So if you don't tolerate dairy, that could be an issue. I tend to make my own pâté because I don't do very well with dairy, and I love pâté. Now, cheese is a tricky one because many people have a sensitivity to dairy, and they may not even know it. And it's anytime somebody has a chronic health condition, dairy would be something that I would very seriously question whether they're tolerating it well. And when I say tolerating it well, this is not an allergy I'm talking about. So it's not like you're going to have that cheese and, break out in hives. This is a different type of immune response, and it tends to be a delayed response. So you don't notice the effects until later, and it tends to be cumulative. So when we have chronic health conditions, it's just often an issue. So I don't ever want to say to somebody, like, don't enjoy the foods that you love, but it might be time to start, exploring like how often you eat them. Alcohol, so that nice glass of red wine, alcohol we know is just so detrimental to human health. In fact, the Canadian government is radically changing their guidelines for alcohol consumption. And alcohol, so your lungs have the highest density of a kind of immune cell called mast cells. And alcohol can be a trigger for mast cells to release inflammatory chemicals. So when we're looking at PF and alcohol, and we know actually that there's mast cell involvement in PF, and Sharon and I have been talking about potentially having future conversations with, talking about mast cells and their role. But alcohol can really impact your mast cells and in turn, your fibrosis. So again, I don't want to say to people like, don't eat these foods. And there are certainly strategies that people can implement. So that's like, as a nutrition professional, that's kind of what I do. Like, what strategies can you put into place to kind of support, occasional consumption of these foods. So that's my long-winded answer.
Okay. We have another question for you. What about the fermented vegetables, like in the Korean culture, the Japanese culture, like the kimchi,
Yes.
and those fermented, like, are they okay for you, like, for your lung health?
Well, that's a really good question. So I actually used to live in Korea and, loved kimchi and was eating a lot of kimchi. And I really got into making my own homemade fermented foods and was making a lot of them. And my health was actually getting worse. I was developing new symptoms. And they're so widely promoted as being beneficial. So here's what I'm going to say. For about 85% of the population, they are beneficial. But for health conditions that have this mast cell component that I was just sort of touching on earlier, these foods can be really detrimental. And so for myself, I actually have a diagnosed condition called mast cell activation syndrome. And this is why I'm so passionate about this topic and have really done a really deep dive into the research. But fermented foods are really high in something called histamine. And histamine is the compound in those foods that can trigger the mast cell piece. So if you have pulmonary fibrosis, I can't say definitively yes or no that these foods are going to be good for you or bad for you. But I would certainly be cautious. So I do not eat fermented foods anymore. Once I started to understand how they were impacting my health, they are completely out of my diet. And there are other things I do because there are benefits from eating those foods. So there are other things I do to get the same benefits. But yeah, that is an excellent question.
So Tracey, some of our patient group population, they want to know, when they're on one of the drug treatments, one of them will like sometimes they'll cause nausea, and other times it cause other conditions like diarrhea. So how can you use food to help you to combat the nausea or the diarrhea and all the other things that come with taking the two drugs?
Yeah, yeah. So, um, some simple strategies, obviously, and you may have heard these from your doctors as well, but eating small meals more frequently. If you're struggling with nausea, I would actually really focus on cooked foods as opposed to raw foods. So cooked foods they're the bioavailability of nutrients is more heightened. So it's just easier to absorb nutrients. And again, if you don't really feel like eating, but you need to nourish yourself, then it becomes really, really important to kind of optimize the nutrients that you can actually get from that food. And then overall, I mean, there's a lot of other things kind of just looking at GI tract health in general. So part of that is looking at the health of the gut microbiome. The other part of that is looking at sort of the health of the intestinal tract itself, the tissue itself. So there's a lot of strategies that can be put into place to support all of that as well. Yeah.
And some people say that they have acid reflux,
Yeah. So acid, and so, okay, Sharon, I don't know if you can kind of put this out to the audience, but I'll say it and maybe people can also just quickly respond. But is the heartburn or GERD associated with the medications, or is that something that was that pre-existed, is comorbid with the fibrosis?
Some people had pre, and some people feel that it came after.
Okay. So with the pre part of it, so GERD or heartburn or reflux, all the same thing. You may have just heard different names being utilized by your doctor. This involves, I won't say it always does, but this can involve mast cells as well. So within your GI tract, so I mentioned that the lungs have, this really, they have the most mast cells of anywhere in the body. Your respiratory tract does, but your GI tract also has a very, very high amount of mast cells. So we often see that people, when there's this mast cell involvement, that people have symptoms show up in different parts of the body. And one of the mast cells release a bunch of different chemicals. And one of the ones they release, it's called histamine. You may have heard of histamine in relation to allergies, but histamine actually signals the production of stomach acid. And so if your mast cells are like really active and they're releasing a lot of histamine, you will make more stomach acidity, and that results in the GERD or the heartburn. And so again, it's not unusual to see sort of these comorbidities or, different symptom profiles showing up in different places in the body. So with that, if you had your heartburn or your GERD prior to medication use, that would be something I would definitely want to explore. And then sort of post medication use, it becomes much more of kind of a management strategy. We can still look at the mast cell side of things. And so one thing I should be sort of upfront with, as a nutrition professional, I am totally unqualified to diagnose. I am totally unqualified to talk about pharmaceuticals. But when I work with my clients, what I help people do is sort of have a conversation with their doctor about some different strategies, like things that I actually cannot legally recommend, but that they should be asking their doctor for to help support things on their end. So we can still work with food, and there are some other nutritional supplements we can work with. But yeah,
And how about collagen peptides? Is it good or bad?
Okay, really, really good question. So again, for most of the population, I would say collagen is really good, but because of the nature of fibrosis, I'm not sure that it is. And that's probably all I can say. So I do have concerns about collagen with fibrosis, and collagen also from a mast cell perspective, because collagen can also kind of trigger mast cell stuff if mast cell stuff is already going on. Yeah. So this is I'm so glad you guys are bringing these questions forth, because there's so much information that is out in the media that all of this stuff is so healthy and beneficial, but it is really unique to each individual and what they're struggling with. So yeah, these are just brilliant questions.
Well, I was going to ask the audience if you have any other questions for Tracey, please put them in the Q&A and I will propose them to her. And as for the individual who want to talk about mast cell, as Tracey had mentioned, that's going to be on another topic that we're working on, because that's going to be a longer period and we won't be able to cover that today. So for those people who are interested in that, unfortunately, that's something we just don't have time to cover today, but we can certainly do it in another session. And if you have questions, please do type them in, because we still have a couple more minutes. And I want to say thank you, Tracey. I've learned a lot about nutrition. And I guess now, personally, when I think about Tom Brady and his last 15 years, about how he hasn't had any sugars or nitrates and all those things, are beginning to kind of make sense to me. Because, I just think to myself, my goodness, you haven't had sugar for 15 years, And
Yeah.
So he really has looked at nutrition as, because he said that his body is his work. So he has to take care of his body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And our bodies are essentially our homes, right? Like we are housed in our bodies, and we can look at moving through life in a way that, as much as possible, we can keep the health of our body going so that we have quality of life as we move through. I think it just puts such a different perspective on kind of aging. If we can keep this house, this home that we're in, as healthy as possible. And food, because food works on a biochemical at a cellular level, with things like the polyphenols that we talked about today, we really have this huge ability to alter our own biochemistry. So yeah, thanks again for having me. And maybe I'll just stop sharing slides for the last few questions, but my website and my email is on here if people want to reach out.
Well, thank you again for your presentation. We've learned a lot. I know our audience has really appreciated, and they are looking forward to hopefully the next session where we are able to talk about mast cells and perhaps about some other foods, some other ethnic fruits and vegetables that are seemingly coming into Canada these days, and often wonder, what can we do with them, and how can we eat them?
Yes, and I love, our planet has this abundance of food. And when we start to explore that, it's so lovely to be able to bring in all this diversity. Yeah, I love that.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Tracey. Thank you for today. I thank our audience, and know that this webinar will be up next week by Tuesday, so that if you missed any portion, you can go back and read again. And I would ask everyone if you would kindly, before you leave this session, if you can answer a couple of questions or polls, because they help us to then understand how can we better improve, or bring Tracey back for another couple of sessions for topics that of interest to you. So thank you very much, everyone. And as you leave, please do fill out those polls, and we appreciate your time and effort. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.